members of the African intelligentsia, I greet you. Today we're going to discuss why we need a unified Africa and what that unified Africa is going to look like. We're going to need to be unified militarily, politically, economically, socioculturally, and in other facets of what concerns us as a continent. First of all, we need to be unified politically. The reason why so many foreign powers are able to enter is because we have all of these different presidents. All 54 countries in Africa have a different president, and every different president has his or her own mindset. Burkina Faso might have problems with France. Well, if Burkina Faso does not want to do business with France, France can go next door to Ivory Coast and do business there and keep an eye on Burkina Faso or infiltrate Burkina Faso from Ivory Coast or Ghana or Togo or Benin. It's the leadership at the top that is the problem. And so in order to be unified politically, we need to do away with the plurality of presidents. I'll say that again. In order to be unified politically, we need to do away with the plurality of presidents. It's all of these individual presidents making conflicting decisions that are allowing our enemies to enter without hindrance. These are the presidents that are opening the gates for our enemies to come through. If they can't enter through my country, they can enter through my neighbor's country and still attack me. And so a lot of these presidents are old and unable to really handle the problems in their countries. A lot of these presidents are inept. A lot of them are selfish and corrupt. And so for all of these reasons, they're not able to seek the best interests of their own countries, let alone how their decisions affect neighboring countries, let alone how their decisions affect the continent as a whole. A lot of these presidents lack vision. They cannot see the bigger picture beyond their own selfish gain. Some of them, the development projects they are doing in their countries are for their own personal legacy, not really because their country needs a new university. And so we need to be unified politically. Now, what is that going to look like? Politically, that's going to look like a unified governing body. Notice you're not hearing me use the word unified under one president. You're hearing me say a unified governing body. And I'll do a separate video explaining what a unified governing body is going to look like. But I'll say this again. Notice you're not hearing me say united under one president. Yes, there will be a leader that will liberate the continent, but it needs to be governed under a unified governing body. A unified governing body. I want to stress that so that we don't think we're taking the entire continent and putting it in the hands of one man or woman. Secondly, we're going to need to be unified militarily. That is because as it stands, some are fighting France while others are letting them in. Some are fighting enemies while others are letting them in. And so let's look at Exhibit B. if you were to look at this map, you can see how many military bases there are across the continent of Africa. It is by the grace of God that our nations are still sovereign. But if you look at this map, it looks as though we are already conquered. So here we have British military training units, British Air Force stations, Chinese support bases, French forward operating bases, French permanent points of support, French regional cooperating bases, French temporary points of support, French territorial defense bases, French naval bases, German air transport bases, Indian built listening posts, Indian built radar posts, Italian support bases, Italian military camp hospitals, Japanese bases, Spanish bases, Spanish naval bases, Spanish air bases, Turkish military training facilities, United Arab Emirates bases, United Arab Emirates bases under construction, U.S. forwarding operating sites, U.S. cooperative security locations, and U.S. contingency locations, all over the continent of Africa. And so we're going to need to be unified militarily. And the very first thing we're going to need to do will be to close all of these bases. We need to close these bases. When you close these bases and we're operating as a unified body under one governing body, then that means all African fighting forces are operating together. That means all African fighting forces, all of the armies, all of the Air Force personnel, Navy personnel, ground troops, all of Africa's military can operate together as one unit to protect and defend this continent. So if you can imagine all of Africa's military fighting the terrorist activity in the Sahel, air power, ground forces, naval power, that could be taken care of in 24 hours. 24 hours. In 24 hours, there will be no terrorist activity anywhere on this continent. Now let's take a look at why exactly there are so many foreign bases on this continent. This piece comes to us courtesy of the Swedish Defense Research Agency. This piece of research is suggesting that behind foreign military presence in Africa is the competition for power and natural resources. So let's read an excerpt from it. Since the beginning of the 2000s, there has been renewed interest in Africa. The USA has established a major military presence on the continent, and new actors such as China, Turkey, and the UAE have set up military bases. Even such traditional actors as France and Italy have increased their military presence. This development indicates that Africa is of growing strategic interest for many countries. Africa is a raw materials producing continent, and approximately 90% of all international trade goods are transported by sea. It is thus not difficult to understand why the military bases are also situated along the coasts. Africa is extremely interesting for those who are after raw materials, for example, minerals and oil. It's obvious that controlling the small number of harbors becomes attractive. The establishment of a military presence is often very much about protecting one's own interests. For example, France, a former colonial power, chooses to intervene in Mali's disturbances because this furthers its own interests. Likewise, Italy is active in Libya not only because of the refugee flows that arose in 2015, but also to protect its energy supply. Sometimes bases have been established to assist the host country in dealing with a problem, such as, for example, pirates off Somalia's coast. Although there has been a marked reduction in pirates' attacks, the bases remain. The reason is primarily to protect their own transports between Asia and Europe as they transit the Horn of Africa, as well as transports to and from the continent, says Carolina Gasinska. But establishing a military presence in Africa is not always only for economic reasons. Much of it is a power game. Countries that want to show they are a global power establish military bases in Africa. Having moved away from wanting to suppress terror around the world, it seems that we are at least partially back in the same situation as during the Cold War. Russia and China want to show their muscles. Competition for power and rivalry among Middle Eastern powers is also being played out in Africa. So, this is why so many countries have bases in Africa. They might tell you they're here to fight terrorism, but somehow the terrorism problem never seems to go away. Meanwhile, as we are fragmented and divided, each country has to fight its own battles. But if we were united, any given battle could be taken care of in 24 hours. We also need to be unified economically. Take a look at this map. You've got countries producing tea, coffee, cocoa, oil, diamonds, gold, iron ore, bauxite, and we're having problems managing our natural resources. Not long ago, former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, gave a speech in which he stated that most African countries are unable to measure how much of any natural resource is being extracted out of their countries. We're actually dependent upon the mining companies to tell us how much they extracted this month, how much they extracted this year. And the suspicion is that mining companies are grossly underreporting their earnings. And so we need to be unified economically. We need to have a body of experts within that governing body. Experts on agricultural produce, experts on iron ore, experts on oil, experts on bauxite, experts on diamonds, experts on gold that are responsible for monitoring and measuring how much is being taken out of the continent at any given time. Meanwhile, billions of dollars are exiting the continent through multinational corporations. And then we're going around looking for aid. And the aid that comes in looks like pennies compared to what goes out. If you look at any multinational corporation, they're run competitively, they're run using top-notch technology, they're run very efficiently and with great accountability. Nation states are some of the biggest businesses in the world, holding billions of dollars of assets. But somehow, we can't seem to get the hang of how to manage them. We need to be able to manage our nation states, our continent, with the same efficiency, accountability, and technological advancement as any multinational corporation. And so we need to be unified economically so that we can also be able to see where the money is going and how the money is coming in. With each different country doing their own thing, we can make sense of what's going and what's coming. We need to be able to keep track of everything in a holistic way. We need to be able to account for everything we have. We MBAs like to say, you can't manage what you can't measure. I'll say that again. We MBAs like to say, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. I can't stress this enough. We need to be able to measure what we have so that we can be able to project. We can be able to do financial projections. How much of it do we need to sell this year? How much do we need to reserve this year? And when we sell this amount this year, is it enough to fill our budgets for this year? Our infrastructure projects, to finance our infrastructure projects for this year. We need to be able to pool the resources of the continent together and manage them in a unified manner. That's economic unity. We also need to be unified socio-culturally. You have Western powers coming in here trying to tell our leaders what to do. You need to be able to accept the ABCD agenda, for example, the rainbow agenda. Because if you don't accept the rainbow agenda, we're not giving you aid. Well, we don't have to need their aid because we have enough. We're wealthy. We don't need their aid. You need to be able to make abortion accessible. Otherwise, we're not going to give you aid. No. Our human resource, our human capital, our manpower is our greatest asset. No, we're not going to accept abortion. And no, we don't need their aid. There's a lot that they're coming in here with, forcing us to accept, that doesn't line up with our African value systems. And we need to be able to manage ourselves economically so that we can be able to maintain our socio-cultural sovereignty. This here is about sovereignty, military unity, political unity, economic unity, socio-cultural unity is about sovereignty. We're not going to be able to maintain our sovereignty if we can manage every other facet of what we have. We need to build infrastructure as a unified body. We need a plan. We need experts to design a plan for a developed Africa. How much of our landmass are we developing in terms of building railways, airports, schools, colleges, universities, vocational training centers? And how much of our landmass are we conserving? We need to be able to build infrastructure with unity in mind, with intra-African trade in mind. So when we develop East Africa, we need to develop East Africa with intra-African trade in mind. As a unit that can trade among themselves, but then that can also trade with West Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa. We need to build infrastructure. We need to envision development with intra-African trade in mind, and that means with one currency in mind. And that needs to happen on paper before we ever put one brick on top of the other. It needs to be designed. We have to design it on paper. Make sure everything is in it. Make sure every facet works together holistically before we begin to build. One of the problems is that everybody's building individually and nothing is working together. Everything is separated and fragmented. And so there's a divide and conquer operation going on from the outside. If I leave Sierra Leone to go to Ivory Coast, I've got to change money. If I leave Ivory Coast to go to South Africa, I have to change money. If I leave South Africa to go to Kenya, I need to change money. And the only currencies that are easily transferable between all of these African currencies are the foreign currencies, like the US dollar. And as you're buying and selling and between different exchange rates from country to country, you're losing money. So we really, really, really need one currency. And as we design and begin to build, we need to build with that in mind. We need to design development with one currency in mind. We need to be unified educationally, academically. We need to bring our brightest minds home. Africa has suffered severely from the brain drain. We need to bring our brightest minds home. We need to decide on our academic curricula. This time around, as we redesign our education systems, we need to tell our own stories. We need to make sure all of our experts are homegrown. I'll say that again. We need to make sure all of our experts are homegrown. That means in any given year, you need to have targets. How many engineers you're graduating? How many doctors you're graduating? How many geologists you're graduating? How many nurses you're graduating? So that one generation of doctors doesn't retire and now you're scrambling to find doctors out of India and America because you don't have enough to staff your hospitals. One doctor per 1,000 patients. We need to have targets. We need to be strategic about our educational system as a continent. We need to have a unified healthcare system. That needs to be designed on paper. Because then you can focus on prevention and cures can really be only used for what they need to be used for. And that will cut your healthcare costs in half. Focus on prevention. Organic foods. Exercise. Personal hygiene. Clean drinking water that's accessible to every village, every community. That needs to be in the development plan. So that by the time you get to healthcare, your new healthcare system is not operating at a point of difficulty because you're having to attack all of these problems at one time. Cholera, malaria, this, that, cancer, this, that. It's about strategy. If you're going to manage this continent like a well-oiled machine, like a multinational corporation, then it has to be managed strategically. The extractive industries, natural resource management, strategically. Uniformity across the board. We need to coordinate food production and self-sufficiency. The way we're operating now is Zimbabwe has a drought, Zimbabwe is on their own. Unless the Red Cross or the United Nations or somebody foreign comes in to help, Zimbabwe is on their own. If there's flooding in Niger, Niger is on their own. Mali and Burkina Faso will only be able to help to the extent that they are able to help. Other than that, Niger is on their own. For every major problem, we are on our own individually. We need to coordinate food production and self-sufficiency. The other thing that's being imposed upon us is this GMO agenda. That needs to be uprooted from this continent. We need to coordinate our food supply and we need to lock the gates to that GMO agenda. We need to lock the gates. Certain presidents, like Kenya, have opened the gates wide to this GMO agenda. I hear Nigeria has done the same thing. But if we are governed under a unified governing body, we can lock the gates to these different agendas that don't serve us. And finally, we need a unified foreign policy. That means we decide who even has an embassy on African territory. We decide who we're doing business with. That means now you're operating from a position of authority and strength. You're not getting dictated to because you're some small African country somewhere that needs a lot of help. So anything they tell you, you'll sign it, you'll do it. If you're operating as a unified African governing body, then you're operating from a position of strength. You can defend yourself militarily, you cannot be threatened, and you're financially stable to be able to manage yourself well and not need anybody's aid. So this is why we need a unified Africa, and we need it now more than ever before. And in the next video, I will describe what that unified governing body looks like. But this has been a follow-on from the prophetic word that was released on Friday, October 25th to Captain Ibrahim Traoré concerning the liberation of the continent of Africa. This was the tangible, the blueprint, the roadmap, if you will, to African unity. Please be sure to follow us on Rumble at the African Intelligentsia. As you know, conversations of this kind are heavily censored on this platform. Thank you for watching, and until next time.